You can turn it down. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Budget Education and City Services Committee of CB5, BEX for short. My name is Renee Kinsella. I'm the chair. Julie Chu is the vice chair. Before we start this evening, I want to welcome some of our new members. We have Kevin here. We have Charles, who is remote. Zarara, am I pronouncing that correctly? I apologize. Hello. Hi. And we also have Noah, who is also joining us for the very first time. So I wanted to welcome our new members. If we could go around the room and introduce our old members, starting with Bradley.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bradley Sherburne.
Hi, everyone. Zona Zoo. Good to see everyone.
Hi, Tristan Haas. Joe Mafia. Hello, everyone.
Kevin Frizz, new member.
Julie Chu. And Renee Kinsella. Tonight, and then we have everyone who has their name on the board who is joining us remotely. So hello, everyone. Tonight, we have three items on the agenda. First is discussion of shed and sheds legislation, which is regulating the sidewalk sheds. We have a representative from the Office of the Manhattan Borough President's office, and then we also have a representative from Councilmember Power's office for that issue. Then we're going to have a presentation by Carbon Quest, which is about building decarbonization. And then we are going to do our committee budget assignments, discussion, and overview. Before we begin, I'd just like to give a brief overview of how the committee works, which is each presenter will have an opportunity to speak to the committee. And after the presentation is concluded, the committee will have the opportunity to ask questions. And then when all the committee's questions are answered, then anyone else who has joined the meeting as an attendee can also ask questions. Once all the questions have been addressed, the committee then goes into what's known as business session. And that's when the committee decides and discusses the issue amongst themselves and determines what action to take. I'd like to stress just for BEX, everyone's view here is really respected in this committee. And I would encourage every single one of you to share your views. We all joined in order to contribute to the betterment of our neighborhood. So the best way for us all to do that is to participate in the conversation and discussion. BEX is somewhat different than the other committees. We don't have the applications. Mike's really happy about that. We don't have the applications that the other committees do. So our determinations are not as straightforward. We can decide to draft a resolution or a letter to support an issue, or we can use the information as information going forward. When the committee does have an action, we vote upon it, and then it goes to the full board, and the action of the full board becomes the position of CB5. Our next full board is July 13th. So to get right to it, we have Chris Carroll from the Borough President's office, and we also have Franklin from Councilmember Power's office, who are going to discuss Shed the Sheds with us, to discuss scaffolding around the city and the package of bills that are wending their way through the council. Gentlemen, if I could ask you to, I'm just going to unmute you so that you can speak, Franklin and Chris.
Hey everyone. So as Renee said, I'm Franklin for Councilmember Keith Power's office. I believe Chris is an attendee at the moment, but should be promoted in any moment. I'm really going to defer to him. He is the expert. He's the eyes behind all this, all the bills. He's been working with my colleague Haley, who couldn't make it tonight, and his office to generate these bills. A lot of them are, it's a package, so a lot of them are from Councilmember Bottcher, Powers, and I believe one is also from Councilmember Marte. But he can go into the specifics of what each bill does and really take the conversation from there. I'm not sure if he's been promoted yet.
Yeah, Franklin, I don't think that Chris is with us yet.
Okay, I can give you a quick rundown of the general overview of what the bills are. So the first three that we'll be talking about is intro 954, 55, and 56. These are the ones that are introduced by Council Member Botcher. One would be the 954 would be scaffolding areas around city green spaces, playgrounds, and park must be at least 12 feet high and avoid cross bracing. 955 would be to make scaffoldings brighter and quieter, requiring scaffolding to have LED lights, at least 90. I'm not sure what the terminology is for that particular one, but just to make them a little brighter. And 956 would establish penalties for property owners who don't apply for a work permit within 6 months of the scaffolding. Stop me if Chris jumps on, so I'm not just rambling. And 970 is where council members' powers bills start getting involved. For him, 970 is a new design requirement for scaffolding, including structures allowed to be painted in several different colors. I know everyone got tired of the green that we would see around the city. I know some other structures have been white as well, but this one we really allow them to be, more colorful. Again, the minimum height will be 12, and it is really just aimed at creating an alternative to scaffolding. 972 would be timelines for removal of scaffolding if no active construction is taking place over an extended period of time. I think when that's going through committee, it will be discussed a little further to really narrow down what that extended period of time will be. And the city can correct unsafe conditions and bill property owners for work. I know a lot of the complaints that I'm sure Mike and Marisa have gotten is that these scaffoldings can't be touched because they just haven't had the ability to work on it. So this would allow the city to step in after a certain period of time to correct those mistakes. And then, of course, bill the owners. At 973, allow newly constructed buildings to have facade examination take place after a couple of years rather than a longer period of time. That used to be, I believe it was 8 years before, and now it's being reduced down. And it is also like a reporting business to get the Department of Buildings to coordinate inspection on the same block at the same time, rather than have them go out at different times. I don't think DOB will like us very much for that, but it's make it a little more efficient. And 971 would change the New York City building code to permit holders who create sidewalk shed or scaffolding are held responsible for damages done to city-owned trees. We all like to protect and replace our trees if they are damaged. The Commissioner of the Department of Parks and Recreation must give permission to disturb/remove tree outside the property line within the public right of way. And again, permit holders must repair, replace damaged tree that are outside the property line within the same public right of way that is damaged due to a sidewalk shed or scaffolding. And last one from Councilmember Powers would be intro 452, which allow the city to establish a pilot program to use drones to inspect building facades. And last one of the package is from Councilmember Marte, which requires the Department of Building to inspect scaffolding every 6 months and issue an administrative fee per inspection. So that's really the package as we've described as Shed the Shed, that the 3 council members, along with other folks that have worked on it, the Manhattan Borough President, which is where Chris is involved, who really did a report earlier this year that led to the just generational change, but generating the report, which will get these bills going. But yeah, I was hoping Chris would be on right now because he really can get into the weeds of what the actual report is. But happy to take any questions in the interim while we wait and see if he's going to join us. I will shoot him a text as well.
Thanks, Franklin. I've also reached out to Chris to see where he is. Are there any questions from the committee about the package of bills? Brad?
Yeah, I have actually 2 questions. First, for the bill that allows scaffolding to be painted in many colors, are there any guidelines or restrictions applied to that? I'm thinking kind of in like historic districts or areas like that.
Yeah, well, I don't think there are any guidelines that govern that at the moment, but while it's still going through committee, that has been something I know that has been discussed. I don't know if they've taken it to a specific area, whether it be like a historical district or anything. They haven't necessarily defined where you can paint certain things yet, but I know it's something that has been brought up. And I'll be sure to take it back to the council member and let him know that this is a concern.
And then the other one was the damage to the trees. How is that enforced or assessed?
So the enforcement would likely come from the Department of Buildings, defining the property owner. Yeah, so if there is, when they put up their scaffolding, they hire a private company who does their scaffolding. If they damage it, it will be up to the Department of Building to find them. I'm sorry, I'm getting text messages trying to figure out where Chris is.
Sorry, just to follow up on that. So is that basically only if they killed the tree, or like, I guess, like, is there like a before and after thing kind of taken, or I just don't understand the mechanism for that.
Right, it at the moment just says damaged, and a lot of times it's easy to just see if something has been completely destroyed. We know that tree will need to be replaced. Damage is a little looser. I would have to take that back and see what exactly it constitutes damage. But happy to get you those answers as soon as possible.
Additional questions from the committee?
Charles.
Charles?
Hi,
Let me-
can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So regarding, I've just three quick questions. So regarding the painting of the scaffolding, I'm wondering if there's a way to speak to some of the blind and visually impaired communities, because I'm worried that if there's going to be all sorts of colors on the poles, it might be hard for someone who's visually impaired to, if they're walking down the sidewalk, to make out the poles, because if they're like maybe blending in with the color of the building, or maybe it's a color that's hard to see in the sunlight, or there's not enough contrast. I'm concerned about that. So I'm wondering if there's a way to speak to some of the communities, the blind and visually impaired communities, to get some input into that. And the other two quick questions are, it's great that there's penalties for, building owners who are, when there's not enough activity happening on the scaffolding. But I'm wondering if there's a way to go further and say, if there's no activity happening and the scaffolding is just staying up, maybe they would be penalized from having scaffolding in the future. Maybe, I don't know if that's going too far. Maybe something that could be considered. And my last point is, I'm wondering if there could be cameras installed under these sidewalk sheds, because there has been people who have been attacked in the city. Most recently in the Upper West Side, there was a lady who was assaulted under scaffolding shed. So I feel like I think safety is really important, because when a scaffolding is in front of the building, it can make it hard for people to be visible. It kind of makes it isolated area, especially if people walking late at night or in the evening. So I'm wondering, with security cameras being so affordable these days, surely some cameras could be installed. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Savior Chris is here, but just to jump off one quick point, I don't think they can prevent folks from getting scaffolding in the future, only because the facade work is important, and to keep New Yorkers safe, we will actually have to have those scaffolding. But Chris is nodding his head, and it looks like he's eager to jump in. So I'm gonna turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Recklin. And hi, everybody. Sorry I'm a little bit late. Yeah, I appreciate the question. There are two complications with some of the things going on with scaffolding, and to your point, it is frustrating that sometimes it seems to be up for a long time without any work being done, and that seems problematic. Oftentimes, that shed is up because there's an unsafe condition of the facade, and so the priority action needs to be making that condition safe. And so you can't just take down the facade because it's been up for a while, because it was put there for a reason. there are lots of ways we're pushing through the legislative package we're working on with Councilmember Powers, as well as the proposals in the Borough President Shed the Shed recommendations to actually increase the ways in which we can facilitate facade work getting done, and then also create carrots and sticks to ensure that it's being done as quickly as possible. But the shed sort of has to stay there until it's safe to walk on the sidewalk. And Franklin's totally right. You can't prevent folks from having to comply with the local law 11 safety components. As far as cameras are concerned, we hadn't heard that recommendation before. It's interesting. Happy to talk to a few folks. Councilmember Botcher has legislation that actually would be changing some of the way in which we're actually doing lighting under these sheds, which obviously is intended to make it so that people are safer and people can very easily see where they're going, and a shed that can be very dark. And the Councilmember Powers' work to really alter the way in which we're designing sheds as well is also I think going to be incredibly important in the way in which we're getting natural light or artificial light at night in some of these places where a shed is required. But I'll pause there.
Thanks, Chris. Moen, I see you have your hand up. And
Perfect. Franklin and Chris, thank you so much for sharing that context. Just a follow-up question on what you had just shared. Oftentimes, from my understanding, the sheds are up because it is sometimes cheaper to keep the shed up than it is to fix the facade. And it's a problem that the government and the city government and council members have been dealing with. You mentioned potential penalties. Can you talk a little bit about those situations where it might not be financially feasible for a building to fix the facade, and what this bill potentially does to address those kinds of situations where they can still comply in a financially feasible, safe way?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Franklin, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to jump in?
All you, my friend.
Councilmember Powers' office is exceptionally collaborative, always a pleasure. But I'll start with the legislative components here. The first is that there are 9 bills in total, all of which speak to a very small part of making facade repair easier to do, and thereby sidewalk sheds up for less time. So there are lots of small pieces that all in their whole are much greater than the individual parts. And I mentioned that just because like enforcement becomes a piece of that, but not the entire ballgame. One of the things in the Borough President's recommendations is creating a financing mechanism for buildings that actually show a financial hardship. There are a lot of buildings, particularly like co-op and condo buildings, FDHCs, Mitchell Lama buildings that actually can't afford a $1.5 million major facade renovation. And so then all of a sudden to them, it's like, yeah, I'd rather have the cost of rent and the permitting fees than pay the $1 million for a thing. Those are buildings we're trying to find a solution for. The mayor has expressed and DOB has expressed interest in that type of financing mechanism, low interest loan program, something like that actually help those buildings. And then to buildings that are actually deciding, screw it, we could pay for it, we just don't want to. It is something that both legislatively and just administratively with the city, we're pushing to increase civil penalty. There are civil penalties exist now. We're trying to increase them. The city increased them, I want to say, as recently as 4 years ago. And there was actually improvement. And so as far as we're concerned, let's do it again. Let's continue seeing progress there. So that buildings that are making that choice just because they would rather not deal with it, those buildings need to be enforced against. Buildings that can't afford the work, we need to do a better job of helping, because ultimately the solution shouldn't be a sidewalk shed that's up for 16 years, which is the case. There's a building seeing sidewalk shed for 16 years in Manhattan, which is crazy.
Thank
you
you.
have a follow-up, or does that answer the?
Thank you for sharing. No follow-up.
Additional question, Justin.
Yeah, just want to follow up to that. So what are the current fines for folks who are delinquent on removing their sidewalk sheds?
Actually, that's a really good question. It's it increments, so it depends on how long there's been an issue. So, and there are different fine schedules for whether it's like a permitting problem, you failed to file a permit or your permit expired, versus a safety problem, your scaffolding's like actually not complying with design requirements or safety requirements in the building code. So the answer is it's complicated, and I'm not actually the expert to be able to give you a sense of like what those numbers are. It is in line actually with what you see in other types of building fine schedules. So it's the sort of thing like you'll see $5,000 fine for X, $5,000 fine for Y. It escalates if it's a period of time that it keeps going. And I think that actually we're hopeful that we're going to see some progress there from the city in the next, in a short little while, where we can see them really start to say we're going to change the way in which we're actually able to enforce against and that sort of thing. It's a challenge for DOB because ultimately we're talking about staff that have to go out and do these things and really ensure there's compliance with the law. Those are budget lines, staffing lines that are right now difficult, but we're pushing with DOB, and I think they get it. This is like the low hanging fruit, enforce the law essentially. Sorry, I don't really have much more detail than that.
Of course, thank you.
Zona.
This is like super pedantic, but I live in a building where there's like scaffolding in front of it, and there's been scaffolding outside my living room for like over the last year. And I was wondering if there's any language around like maintaining the scaffolding, so like garbage buildup, dust, just trash that accumulates on it.
Yeah, I mean, building is still required to make sure that either the construction site is clean or, like there isn't being trash just thrown out on your property. People have to maintain the property they own. So like there's a DSNY issue. If there's a problem there, then it's worth flagging for DSNY and for the city to make sure they know that there's potentially a problem with people not actually managing refuse. And then as far as like scaffolding falling apart, it has to be safe. And so if there's wood that's rotting, or there's metal that's become compromised by the weather, like that's a public safety issue, and DOB is supposed to be able to come in, issue a penalty, and require the contractor to repair and ensure that it is actually safe for a place for people to walk. If that's not the case, it has to be flagged for DOB, and it's a good thing to do. So happy to help facilitate that with the team at the VP's office if there's a problem.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Reg, another.
I was using good Mary up there.
Oh, Mary, I'm sorry. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just quickly, I wanted to follow up on Charles. I don't, maybe I missed it, but did you address his question about cameras? Because there's an undeniable link between these sheds and increased crime.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not something that we had heard before as an idea, and it's something that I'm more than happy to talk to DOB about. The one part we are recognizing here is that there is certainly a design need and a lighting need for these sidewalk sheds, particularly as you get farther into residential neighborhoods where there is less ambient light around. So it's definitely something that we're addressing through this legislative package between the council member and Councilmember Bottcher. But the cameras is something we hadn't thought of, so we just gotta circle up and definitely will recommend it to the city.
Thank you. Additional questions? I have a question. Can you speak a little bit about the pilot for the drones? Is that currently happening, or is it about to happen?
Franklin, do you want to take this one because it's Keith's bill, or do you want me to jump in?
I don't think it's currently happening, if I remember correctly. It is something that has been talked about from many different angles. In particular, some folks are concerned about privacy. And I know they're trying to work a way around how to address that as well. But it's not currently happening to my knowledge.
And is there any sense of how the pilot would roll out if it in fact does happen as part of the?
I think that's being worked through right now on the back end. I will have to check in with Haley on that part. But yeah, it's slowly developing.
Thank you. Moet.
Yeah, just a follow-up question on the drones point. I understand that I think it's currently against FAA regulations to have drones in New York City. So would this bill also take into account a change in those regulations, and would those only be for like the use of the city, or would they also open this up to commercial usage of drones in the city?
Yeah, we're not touching the commercial use component of this because that is an FAA issue. And to the extent that the FAA bans drone use, they do allow it for certain situations where you can get a permit. Like NYPD, FDNY, emergency management, they actually use drones when they're inspecting a disaster area. Example, when that parking garage in Lower Manhattan collapsed, they were using drones to figure out what went wrong, is it safe to enter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what we're really thinking is figuring out a way to use it for building inspection specifically. There are all sorts of questions about it, for Franklin, to Franklin's point, like we're still working on what those look like. And it's the reason why we're thinking pilot first, to really kind of get a sense of like, are there privacy concerns and how to control for that and ensure that, any sort of image that's taken is very much controlled for, as well as figuring out like, does it actually result in not needing sidewalk sheds as often? I think there's actually an open question about that, and one that would have to actually see how it goes. It's possible that a drone could actually be even more adept at identifying facade challenges that then would trigger sidewalk shed going up, which that's not the outcome we want here. So the really think the pilot is being the kind of thing that really test some of this out, and then kind of see whether it's worth expanding citywide.
Thank you.
Charles. Charles?
Yeah, sorry, just one quick question. I was just wondering, what are the consequences for a building owner who either ignores the penalties or pays the penalties but keep on violating?
Well, it's possible if there's an unsafe condition that never gets remedied, it is possible for the city to come in and through emergency powers, do it for them. If that happens, then the sidewalk shed no longer becomes necessary, but the work is expensive and it puts a lien on the building. One of the recommendations that is included in the borough president's report is actually encouraging DOB to use those emergency powers far more aggressively. And when there is a time when there's an unsafe facade that is not getting repaired, the solution shouldn't be put up a shed and just hope everything's gonna be okay. The city should step in and do the work. There are then penalties for leaving a shed up for extended periods of time without renewing, and every time you renew, you have to pay for it. It also costs a lot of money to just have the equipment. And generally, and I'm not a property owner myself, but when you have an unsafe building, the insurance associated with then owning that building becomes increasingly problematic, financially speaking. So there are also like market reasons why you should want to fix your building if there is a truly dangerous facade condition. We're pushing the city to actually increase what those civil penalties look like. And we're pushing the city to actually do way more enforcement of the current condition of facade as well as the condition of the sheds. But there are mechanisms there currently that try to do it. We just want them to go a little bit farther.
Chris, just to follow up on that, one of the bills identifies the time period in which, what is that time period? Do you know yet?
Yeah, so right now for local law 11, any building that is over 6 stories has to go through an inspection cycle every 5 years. It is our opinion and the BP's office, and I think we speak for Councilmember Powers' team, that we share this, that we think that needs to be extended both for new buildings as well as for buildings that are made of certain materials. I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to list out what those materials should be, but I think colloquially and generally we can say that terracotta and brick should not be in the same category as steel and glass. Terracotta starts disintegrating almost immediately, whereas steel and glass much slower. And so there's no reason that those two materials should be on the same cycle. Right now, what we've been talking about is actually extending that to 7 years for a new building, for 7 years for certain materials, as well as for any building that does a full renovation of their facade, a major project. That building should actually be kind of rewarded for doing all that work and extend that first cycle for that building as well. If you've replaced everything, you shouldn't then get inspected as if you'd been using the same facade for 25 years. So trying to extend that by a couple of years to just give everyone over the course of time a little bit of a break from having to get inspected constantly.
Thank you. Additional questions? Any more questions from the committee? Any questions from our attendees? Mike?
Yeah, hi, my name is Mike Kabak and I am a walking tour guide in Manhattan. I'm walking around the streets with groups on a daily basis. And I am dealing with the constricted sidewalks, so this is a big deal to me. So I just want to make sure, when you say higher, the clearance, you're meaning the bottom of the floor or the support beams that are sticking down? What is the definition of the height? I got a bunch of questions, that's one.
Great, I love all the questions, I'm ready for them. We're talking about height, we're talking about the floor, but we're also in design changes. The industry is already looking at ways in which we can actually alter the way we actually do support beams, either horizontally or vertically. If you look at Urban Umbrella as an example, it's, I don't know if you all went through this before I got here, but Urban Umbrella is the only company right now in New York City that can do those super fancy, tall, white facades. It's a monopoly. There's no reason why every company couldn't do some sort of similar type design where you have individual poles and then much higher up be able to create facade, sidewalk, shed, pedestrian protection. And so pushing the city to like make it so that people can paint it more colors, white, the same color as the building, shouldn't have to always be that forest green color. And also it needs to be higher. And that includes the height of the ceiling, but also it needs to be design changes to allow for, alternative ways for people to get through. The public right of way is extraordinarily valuable in New York City. And so we want to make sure that people can take full advantage of it.
I was just worried about the structure that's holding up this 12-foot high ceiling, and then you got the beams that are interfering with the side.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Okay, number two. We talked about two rooms. Okay, so now there are some of these sheds that are held up by the building and a beam. And some of them are held up by the building and two beams. Those two beams are strategically placed on the sidewalk to specifically hinder traffic walking through, if you notice that. Somebody's walking this way, two people walking that way, and you got the supports, the building that supports the street, and there's very little room. Is something going to be made to define the amount of walkable through space that's allowed when under a sidewalk shed? Is that covered?
The short answer is yes. I think that what legislation is intending is for there to be design changes for all of this. But I'm not an engineer, so I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. The city will have to go through probably an RFP process to collect design proposals on alternative ways of doing traditional sidewalk sheds. The caveat I'll add though is that we're also pushing for alternative methods to the traditional shed, right? Whether that's netting on the side of a building, a cantilever system for new construction. You could actually do a lot of pedestrian protection without having that shed up in the first place. And so we're trying to push the city to allow for additional designs that don't require what you see now.
So it is being looked at. Another question, enforcement. Is there going to be a patrol going around 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue, 36, 37, 39th Street, checking out, making a mark on the tire, seeing how long it's been since the last check?
Since the last check, I don't know. DOB is very, very good about putting online the length of each permit. And they have inspections that go around and are checking every building site and construction site regularly. I'm sure the DOB, if they were in this meeting, would say, yeah, we have a certain number of people that we have available for that. And so they go as quickly as they can. And I think that, I'm comfortable saying that both Keith and Mark would love to see more money to allow for more enforcement. So I think we definitely want that, whether they're, scraping it with a piece of chalk. I hope that's more sophisticated than that, but you know, definitely want to see as much enforcement as we can to ensure that these things are safe.
Question. Local 11 says every 5 years. Does that 5 years begin when the scaffolding goes up, or do certain building owners put the scaffolding up and then wait and wait and wait and wait, and then do it after 3 years of scaffolding, and then their new 5 years begins at the end of when they've done it? So they've gotten away with renting the space, the scaffolding for 3 years at a cheaper cost and extending their renewal 5 years?
I'm not entirely sure I followed, but I'm sure that there are, you know, property owners as well as contractors that, you know, figure out ways to save and make as much money as possible. But, you know, I think what we're trying to do is make it so that, you know, the facade work gets done as quickly as possible, because no one wants scaffolding up. It's no one's ideal situation, no matter what. So
Can you send to the board those Franklin, those 970, 971, 2, 3?
We have them, Mike.
We have,
I can send them to you as long as
wanna take
the
a
borough
look at it.
presidents. Yeah.
all right, I've done for a while.
Additional questions from any attendees?
Renee, I just have one if you
Oh,
want.
absolutely,
okay?
Kevin, yes,
Okay,
please.
great. Chris, I think you both have mentioned a number of ideas to reduce the presence of scaffolding in the city overall, you know, increasing the number of fines, increasing the length of time between when the buildings need to get examined, researching different types of scaffolding or different types of structures that could replace scaffolding. Which of these initiatives do you think has the best chance of actually happening? Not to put you on the spot, but
I love that question. That's great. Franklin, I'm gonna take seniority on this one. Love this question. The first thing I'll say is that on its own, any individual piece of this won't change our experience on the street. If we change design, the sheds will stay up. They'll look better, they'll feel better, but they'll still be there. If we extend the compliance period, they'll go up a little less often, but they will still feel the same and look the same. If we don't create ways to finance for buildings that actually have a financial hardship, those buildings will just leave the sidewalk shed up because they can't afford the project. And so if you actually go through, like we have, I think it's 11 or 12 recommendations, that we have 9 bills in the council. It really is, each one of these things we hope actually works together to make a difference on a lot of these pieces. And you know, there are other things even we haven't talked about. There's situations in which we have a Landmarks Preservation Commission problem, where if your building is in a landmark district or historic district, which is 30% of Manhattan, and your building is over 6 stories and is built with terracotta on the facade, you have to replace that terracotta with terracotta. The problem is there are 2 terracotta manufacturers in this country. So now you're talking about a permitting process at LPC, then a permitting process at DOB, then a sidewalk shed is up. Now you're designing terracotta. Now you're getting a sample of terracotta. Then you're getting all of it shipped. And by that point, it's been a year. And so there are so many pieces of this that need to get addressed. I would say that there's low-hanging fruit that we can all, you know, try to push through and get across the finish line. And then there's the harder stuff. I really think that we can make some changes at LPC to make it so that, like, there are ways in which you don't need to or situations you don't have to replace 1-for-1 terracotta. That extends projects for a year. I think there are also ways in which we can do the design changes in Councilmember Powers' bill that actually would make a big difference for your lived life on the street. And I think that there are ways in which we can actually, and the mayor has, you know, expressed support, and DOB has expressed support, figure out ways to actually finance some of these things so that we can actually help buildings that are just truly can't afford to do the work, and as a result leave the shed up. I think they're actually all very achievable. I think that we're going to see some progress soon on some of them, and just hoping that, you know, with the community board support and with, you know, honestly, I'm hoping that every community board in Manhattan wants to take this on as a priority, pushing the council and then pushing the speaker and then pushing the mayor to do these things. Because, I think each piece works very well together and hopefully we can get some progress. This is a Manhattan issue. This is one of those things that 4.1 thousand sidewalk sheds in Manhattan, which is a plurality for the entire city. There are 9,000 sheds in the entire city and 12.1 thousand are in Manhattan alone. There's enough sidewalk shed to get from Mark's office, if you line it all up, all the way to Montreal. So I'm not joking. So like there's a lot of progress, a lot of stuff we can do, and I think it all really works together. So
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Going once, going twice, and I'm looking at attendees. Any questions from anyone else in the audience? I'm seeing none. We're gonna move into business session. What do you all think about the package and the borough president's ideas around the sheds and supporting the work that these bills are doing? Comments? Kristen?
I think I'm supportive. I think we've heard from a lot of people in the community over the years that how unhappy they are with sheds going up and staying there for many years. And I think it's a very multifaceted issue. Like, I think the proposals kind of do a good job addressing or at least raising the different aspects of the problem. So I think I'm supportive of like a resolution that would address this.
Julie?
I'm supportive as well, but I'm worried about the small landlords in the outer boroughs where if there's requirements for higher sidewalk sheds, that could be more expensive for them. I just wonder about the consequences for the small landlords.
We are in business session, but I'm gonna allow that as a question to see if this has been addressed, if you don't mind. Chris or Franklin, can you address the issue of small businesses outside of Manhattan? Specifically that would have to deal with the expense of larger sheds?
sure. No one has to comply with local law 11 unless they're over 6 stories. So like it's true, like single family homes, 2-family homes in Queens or Brooklyn and the Bronx, they don't have to worry as much about being required by the city to do facade inspection and then put up a sidewalk shed. They would if there was some sort of construction going on the site, but that'd be true for anybody. And the height of the shed actually shouldn't change anything. Our hope is that with a financing program, low interest loan type program the city could run for any property owner that demonstrates financial hardship, that then you could actually really make it actually easier for people to comply. And again, that's only for people to have to comply with local law 11, which is 6 stories above.
It makes sense, but 6-story buildings are not necessarily that big. They could still be smaller landlords.
I understand. Mohit, do you have any comments? We're running back to business session. We're in comments.
Yeah, I would just like to echo what Tristan said earlier. I would be extremely supportive of this as a resolution overall. I really appreciate Chris and Franklin talking to this in detail. I think they also pose it with like a very realistic picture of what this could look like as a starting point, as a holistic approach that obviously needs to become more comprehensive over time. But I really appreciated the approach, and I think it's a cross Manhattan issue that it definitely needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Additional comments? Anyone in the committee?
Yeah.
Joe? Oh, sorry.
No, good. I'd be supportive of Bill.
I would too. I think to sort of Bovik's comment, I think I would be supportive of even more than this. So this is a good starting point for me. With some of the concerns that we've raised. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just pile on to Boyd and Bradley's comment. Like it's reassuring to hear them that we're all kind of anti-shed together. But this seems like a realistic, good step.
Laura?
First, I'd like to say, I'm sorry, I came in late, I just came from work. But yes, I am supportive. From the last piece of what I've heard, I am supportive.
Thank you. Thank you. Charles?
Yes, I'm very supportive and I really appreciate what the two representatives had to say about the bill. So yes, I definitely fully support it.
So what I'm hearing is I'm getting the general sense from the committee that we're supportive of the package that the borough president's put together and the bills that Councilmember Powers has pending, recognizing that, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of fleshing out what, you know, the details, but generally we're very supportive of how this is moving along. I would add the caveat in our resolution. I think that both Charles and Mary mentioned about considering cameras and would ask you to think about that as well. I think you said that you would bring that back. So hearing what I'm hearing, do I have a motion? Anyone?
Motion to support.
Motion to support the package.
Seconded.
You won't send the borough president's package and also the bills, so you know what we're talking about, okay? And we have a second, so we'll take this to a vote to support with a resolution. The borough president's package and the bills that are coming through, recognizing, you know, they're still in development.
Renee,
Yes.
I'm a yes. Mohit,
Yes. I think you guys are in mute potentially.
No,
Oh, we can hear you again.
can you hear us?
Yes, can hear you now.
Barely.
Are you like, yes? Mary, are you in favor? Yes?
Yes, we can't really hear you guys. It's very faint.
All right, let me just see if I can address that while you go on to the vote.
Yes.
Laura,
Yes.
Kristen,
Yes.
Zayar, sorry. But
Mary, is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Gerard, are you in favor of the motion to support? the
Yes.
package? Thank you.
Sorry, you cut out for a second.
Thank you.
Joe.
Yes.
Charles.
Yes,
Yes.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, motion passes. Chris, Franklin, thank you so much for being, tonight we'll present this to our full board, which is happening on the 13th. And then, you know, obviously the position that the full board takes will be the position of CB5, and I'm sure you'll be there that night, you'll hear. But thank you very much for coming tonight and answering all of our questions.
Thank you all. Have a
Thank you.
great night.
Have a great night. I put my email in the chat, and so if there's anything that I can be helpful with, don't hesitate. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. Next, we have Brian. Brian, tell me if I'm saying your name correctly, Sparrow and Benjamin Roberts, along with Anna Pavlova from Carbon Quest, and they're going to talk about technologies. This group is working on technologies. Tristan was instrumental in having them come to talk about this in line with sort of local law 97 and the rules around that, decarbonization. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get the accelerator program here tonight, which we wanted to discuss as well. But maybe you can give us like a brief overview, Tristan,
Yeah,
and introduction.
Absolutely. So as a bit of background, so local law 97 requires many buildings to meet new energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emission limits by the next couple of years. And so much of the historical focus in this area has been on, electrification of buildings to reduce emissions, which in many cases can be, very, very expensive and time consuming. And so what we wanted to talk about today was alternative pathways for certain buildings to achieve these goals. And so I think Julie first came across them related to her work, and she mentioned it once, and we had called to discuss it with them. And so essentially Carbon Quest is like an on-site turnkey carbon sequestration solution that essentially could be installed into, all these buildings around you that have, not electrical heating and other services, and suck it out or liquefy the CO2 and essentially sell it to third parties like cement producers or other users of carbon to sequester or use that. And so that can essentially both serve as an avenue to reduce their emissions as well as to commoditize the product and essentially pay off the investment on a shorter term basis. But I'm sure Brian will do a much better job explaining it for us. So the floor is yours, Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Hi there, everyone. Oh, Tristan, first of all, that was perfect. I actually shouldn't have to say anything now. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak about, as Tristan mentioned, carbon capture and sequestration as it relates to helping buildings decarbonize, either for sustainability purposes or for compliance, like it's related to Local Law 97. Calling you or Zooming today from inside your community board at 142 West 57th, where our office is. So we appreciate all the work that you do. I'll share my screen as we have materials, and would be happy to share separately if helpful. So I know that you know that here. Let me just bring this up. So the purpose for today is to explain more about building decarbonization and to create awareness around options that building owners have to decarbonize. Just looking at the problem statement, buildings focused on reducing emissions. Typically, buildings comprise 60 to 80% of emissions in cities. In New York City, buildings comprise roughly 67% of emissions, which is one of the reasons why Local Law 97 was enacted, and other cities like Boston, Toronto, Tokyo, Vancouver, Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, all coming up with similar styles of programs to have buildings comply and reduce emissions in accordance with significant targets that have been set for cities to reduce emissions. Over 1,000 global cities have carbon reduction targets or emissions targets. So we believe it's a matter of time before other cities follow others, cities leads, particularly New York City with Local Law 97. What we're finding is driving building owners across the board to reduce emissions would be both the regulatory side in terms of compliance, then also corporate or sustainability drivers, which was typically more so suited for large corporations, but we do find that real estate companies have ESG, environmental, societal, and governance goals, as well as sustainability goals. Our particular focus as it relates to carbon capture, as Tristan mentioned, is around natural gas usage in buildings. So if you think boilers for heating and hot water, there are engines and what's called cogeneration and combined heat and power to create steam and heat in buildings, as well as fuel cells. This is the area of focus, and roughly 20% of the emissions in the United States come from natural gas usage in both residential, commercial, and industrial buildings. In New York City in particular, emissions from buildings, as we mentioned, are roughly 67%. A big portion of that is natural gas that's utilized in buildings. Almost 10 million tons of CO2 comes from natural gas consumption in buildings. So a big focus of building owners, of course, and managers and community boards such as yourself, would be how can we help reduce emissions in this way, either through technologies, business models, new ways of reducing emissions from natural gas usage. At the same time, Local Law 97 is a big driver. It becomes a big part of the interest in what we're doing and the conversations we're having to retrofit existing buildings to help them comply with local law 97, but also to reduce emissions. And Urban Green Council, which is a group located in New York that's focused on coming up with research and solutions to help buildings reduce emissions, estimates roughly a $20 billion market opportunity and cost for buildings to start complying with local law 97. Quite frankly, this is one of the reasons why we started Carbon Quest, is the huge opportunity, but the big need to start reducing emissions. So what does this mean for a specific building owner? We just talked high level. This is a property in New York City. It's from the New York Accelerator website through a group called AKF. It's a large property that uses cogeneration and CHP to create heat and steam. The arrow on the right here shows that about 70% of this property's emissions and energy comes from natural gas consumption. In particular, it's from a system that was installed 10 years ago and was encouraged to be installed. Typically, if building owners are buying systems like boilers or cogeneration, CHP, HVAC, they're expecting to see that investment through 10, 20, and in many cases, 30 years. This particular property is facing a $12 million penalty starting in 2024. That's due to local law 97 that steps up by 2030, 2035. It's estimated by REBNY that roughly almost $1 billion of penalties will expected to be paid through local law 97 by 2030. And so, as you all, I expect you know, it's a really big issue for property owners. In this case, this property owner is going to struggle to reduce emissions otherwise. But what are the options that they do have? There is the option we discuss of buying offsets. There's potentially there is language within local law 97 itself that restricts the amount of offsets that they can buy or where they're bought from. But it is an option for a real estate company or a real estate property anywhere to utilize offsets as an alternative. Another carbon mitigation option would be on-site renewables like solar. In urban environments, that becomes very challenging given the structure of and the size of buildings. There's energy efficiency to better manage and operate buildings using different types of technologies. Then, as Tristan mentioned, one of the big options that is considered for decarbonization in cities like New York would be electrification. What that really means is to take an existing boiler or combined heat and power system, remove it, replace all the wiring or the pipes, put in heat pumps and electric boilers, rewire buildings, and then having the overall city and state through renewable energy, offshore wind and solar to deliver renewable energy, which is definitely an option. And then what we're considering here in terms of building carbon, what we call carbon capture. The challenge we're finding with electrification, which is generally the comparative to carbon capture, would be for large buildings in particular that are really those that are subject to local law 97. It tends to be quite expensive to electrify an existing building. In many cases, in the examples that we're looking at, 3 to 10 times more expensive to electrify than for doing carbon capture. And that really comes down to the fact that buildings are big and it requires a lot of work to get them outfitted for being electric because they're needing more electric capacity. And it also puts a lot more pressure on Con Ed to provide that electricity to these properties. And there's several within your district that we've talked to that are facing this challenge right now. So how does the carbon capture process work? It's a 4-step process. What we do is we extract the exhaust that it would have otherwise got out a chimney. So if you think a boiler creates steam, all that exhaust goes out the chimney, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, oxygen, water vapor, and it leads to ultimately higher carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. We're preventing it from going out by going through a mechanical-based system. We separate the carbon dioxide from the nitrogen and oxygen. We then convert that carbon dioxide into liquid carbon dioxide. Think carbonated water. It is beverage grade. You can drink it. It's up to you if you'd want to do that. But what we do then, as Tristan mentioned, is we sell it locally where CO2 is being used, liquid CO2, being used for concrete manufacturing, building materials. It's being used as a replacement for petroleum and plastics, locally here and then throughout the country. And so what this does is it reduces the emissions that were otherwise used to heat your grandmother's apartment and turn that into a product that can be used. So it's an alternative for reducing emissions for a building owner. What are the benefits? It's immediate decarbonization. It's cost effective. So we're finding in many cases 4 to 7 year payback. It's not disruptive to a building. So we're not having to replace anything in a building. The building operates just how it would. Where does this work? In all sorts of buildings, from multifamily to commercial office, schools, hospitals. And then we measure and impact the emissions. So we actually have a report that suggests and shares how much emissions have been reduced. The picture on the right is a concrete manufacturer in Brooklyn that utilizes our carbon dioxide in their concrete process. They sell blocks throughout New York City, including One World Trade Center. And it's a lower carbon concrete, and which is a good thing because concrete manufacturing creates a significant amount of emissions, about 8% of overall emissions. Here's an example of a case study of a project that we did in the Upper West Side, right across from Lincoln Center at 1930 Broadway. The property owner's goals was to both reduce their emissions significantly, but also to potentially reduce their exposure to local law 97, because there is a cost. The penalties are real. And what we're hearing from this customer, but many others, is that with all the penalties going forward, there is the potential that, especially for those property owners that utilize mortgages to finance their properties, these penalties will eat into their net operating income. And they're trying to look at options that they could use to reduce these penalties in order to keep their credit and their credit ratings at as high a level as possible in order to avoid potential higher costs of borrowing. And so this all fits into this example. 1930 Broadway, here's a few pictures. What does it look like? It's generally a small room that can be located indoors, either in a boiler room, adjacent to the boiler room, on a setback, on rooftop. Not every building has space available. And if that's the case, then this technology may not work. But as it relates to local law 97, there are 35,000 buildings that use natural gas that will be facing a penalty by 2035, many of which will struggle to reduce emissions. So it serves a really important purpose as we see it. Here are a couple areas for CO2 market utilization, from concrete to fuels to aggregates. It's an enormous and growing market. And finally, how are people engaging? We're doing New York is our initial market, given the catalyst that Local Law 97 has become to focus on technology and supporting real estate and building decarbonization. We've been working with the Department of Buildings on how to incorporate carbon capture into Local Law 97. We're working on a pilot right now. We would like to see this move more quickly because there's a real cost associated with complying. And this is a viable solution, albeit one that is relatively new because it hasn't had to be used before, because there hasn't been laws like Local Law 97 out there. Identifying potential candidates for building decarbonization and carbon capture in community 4 to 5 and beyond, and then creating community outreach and awareness. We're trying to create more awareness about the virtues of what's being done here. It's safe, It's been permitted by the Department of Buildings, FDNY, DEP. It works. It serves a great opportunity to help the city meet its goals, as well as real estate companies meeting its goals as well. And I'll stop there and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brian. Questions from the committee about the technology? Brad?
I have a few. How much of this technology is in use right now or soon to be? Sort of like what's the current state?
So traditionally, carbon capture has been, the question was how much is it, if you can, I could slightly hear it, but how much of the technology is being used today? The answer is that carbon capture in general has been utilized traditionally at large power generation and oil and gas facilities to reduce emissions. And so there's hundreds of projects throughout the world doing this, and we're doing the same thing, but taking it down to a building level. And so in New York, we're the first group that we have seen do this. We're seeing others in some other markets in California and in Washington State and Canada do this as well. But that's really where this is being done today. It's starting to grow very quickly. I might also add that the federal government has been spent $10 billion on starting to build out carbon capture and utilization through the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's starting to spend more money because it believes it's critical in order to meet our overall decarbonization goals. And that falls in line with the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which states that carbon capture is also critical to meet our ultimate objectives globally.
Do you have a sense of how the market for the product of carbon capture is? Sorry if you can't hear me, let me know. How the market for like the people who buy the product that comes as a result of carbon capture, how that matches up with sort of the potential supply created by the system. Like, do you have a sense of what is the scale matchup between those two things? Because I saw in one of your slides, the person who did it paid it off in 5 years, but I assume that's because there's a relative scarcity on the product that you're making. So is that correct? And if so, do you have a sense of how those things match up, supply and demand?
So the end product in this case that we have is liquid carbon dioxide. Again, it's carbonated water. It's a $10 billion industry throughout the United States. And it's growing due to the fact that concrete materials have a high carbon content in the manufacturing. So the market here's a few examples. The numbers may not provide the right value here, but it's a $1.3 trillion expected to be a $1.3 trillion industry by 2030 because of the need of CO2. Right now, the supply of CO2 is limited, mostly because ethanol and ammonia production, this isn't as relevant to New York City, of course, but ethanol, ammonia, and fossil-based production is shutting down in the Northeast. And so if we have a beverage outside where you all are right now, it's a high likelihood that CO2 is coming from Texas or Virginia, which creates additional emissions of shipping it up here. So the market opportunity for CO2 is immense. And really what's happening is that all the concrete manufacturers are now shifting over to utilizing technologies that utilize CO2 in it. So the market locally is really large. We could do with carbon capture, we did an analysis and we can do today 10,000 projects easily. We've done 10. So that's not thing to be, it's a new technology. everything started once at some point, right? And then has grown. And so we spend a lot of time specifically on what we do to make sure it's safe. It's got all the proper certifications and things like that. DOB, FDNY, DEP approval.
Thank you. And then final question, beyond physical space for the actual carbon capture apparatus that you showed us, and I assume probably the type of building system that a building uses, are there any other limitations on where this system could be applied within existing structures?
Currently, we're focused on natural gas. So that's really where the focus is for the opportunity. There is an additional opportunity where Con Ed does have existing steam plants. They provide steam and heat and power to right down 6th Avenue for all the commercial offices there, as well as down in the financial district and some other areas. But that we haven't yet done that. You could do that at a Con Ed plant level. If that's ever mandated, it would be really great, and this technology would definitely work in that case. So we're really focused on natural gas is for one. Location wise, there really isn't a limitation other than space availability. And then it's just become, it's very akin to a boiler system. It's akin to HVAC equipment. So it's a matter of just engineering firms, local engineering firms, and national engineering firms that we're working with, specifying it within a building as an option. And so we're seeing this a lot in like redevelopment boilers where engineers are specifying this together, because at some point, at least what may happen is if boilers or combined heat and power systems are being mandated to be low carbon, it's very challenging right now. Carbon capture is a consideration that one could consider as a way to reduce emissions in that way. And so, that's how I would answer that question. We're doing outdoor, indoor installations. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, follow-up? Yeah, Brian, I just want to follow up on Bradley's question, because I think when we talked a month ago, you mentioned this cost of the installation really only works for buildings of a certain size. Do you remember? Like 200 unit building? I don't remember exactly the size of the building that's most appropriate for your technology.
Yeah, what we're focused on, this is more of a business decision than a technology decision, are buildings roughly above 100,000 square feet. Just because of the cost of building these projects out. And so we focus on properties above 100,000 square feet and up. In particular, it works well in campus style settings where a property may have a number of buildings and they have distribution. They have maybe an engine or cogeneration, works very well there, large boilers. And so generally speaking, above 100,000 square feet. However, the technology will work down to, a single family home. This is just a personal opinion. We believe single family homes are much easier to electrify than doing something like carbon capture. And it's just more operationally challenging to pick up CO2 from every single property. So that's how I would answer that question in terms of the focus is really for us above 100,000 square feet. Those are also the types of buildings that are harder to electrify. There are also types of buildings that are subject to local law 97 and potentially facing more pressure to reduce emissions.
science to make this technology, that's been out there for a while, and in other words, is the science old, technology new, or is both?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't know if I was the only one. I only heard a little bit of that.
You know what I mean? I'm trying to understand, was the science for this there the entire time and the technology was just put together? Or is even the science driven by, to carbon capture, is that also new? Was that just recent?
Yeah, it's a good question. So is the science new or is the application new? The application is new. In the sense that the science has been there. We focused on making this as small a footprint as possible, as safe as possible, doesn't require people operating a plant or anything like that, and that it could be economically done. And so those are the main drivers of the design. And so, but the application itself really hadn't been done. Commercial office building in New York or LA or San Francisco or, a hospital hadn't really had to think about this before. And so there hadn't been a reason to reduce emissions. But now with sustainability becoming a big driver, specifically Scope 1 emissions, now with programs like Local Law 97, if you're familiar with what's going on in Boston, there's a similar program called BERDO 2.0. Canada has a federal carbon charge on natural gas consumption. It's just driving the interest, so that's the main reason, is the application behind this, but the science has really been there for decades. And the application has been less focused on buildings because it hadn't had to be before. But now buildings are facing potential penalties anywhere from $5,000 a year to $5 million or more. And so it becomes a driver. And the tangential benefits, in a way, for these types of new technologies are jobs, innovation. We're working with schools here in the city, explaining what we're doing here, that's driving interest. We have students and interns that are saying, "Oh, this is really interesting," right? And look, it's just one. We live it and we love it. It's just one aspect of building decarbonization. It's not the only one. It's one tool in the toolkit. But that's I ad-libbed a bit from your question, but that's kind of how we're seeing this emerge.
Can you hear me? Do you have a question?
Sorry, were you calling on me? Okay, I can see it from your face. I can read the lips. But Brian, thank you so much for sharing. I think it's a really amazing application of technology to potentially reduce emissions on a smaller scale. I would have two questions for you. One of the concerns, and you just touched on this a little bit with carbon capture, is that it potentially creates lock-in, and there's this potential to prolong actual fossil fuel usage by limiting the transition to electrification or cleaner energy sources. Can you talk a little bit to how carbon capture can potentially coexist with electrification and utilizing other energy sources?
Sure, and it's a great question. There's a few points to this. So one, we can consider carbon capture a bridge to a lower carbon future and perhaps a more electrified future. Two, it's likely, and New York State has done research on this, and many other states and throughout the country, there's likely going to be natural gas infrastructure in place for a very long time, especially as it relates to resiliency, hospitals that have multiple sources of energy and building that out. And so with that in mind, there may always be a role for natural gas, and therefore, a role for carbon capture as well, in order to reduce those emissions, even if they're lower than the 10 million tons of CO2 that's present today. We have some pretty significant goals as New York City and New York State, 80% reduction by 2050. There'll likely be a role here as well. And if that sunsets at some point where carbon capture starts to go away because we're electrifying things, then so be it. But the third thing I'd say more at a micro level is someone told us recently, and I'd have to double check about this, but we were told that 30,000 new boilers were installed in New York City in the last 4 years, right? So what those owners typically want to see those investments last 20, 30, 40 years. The cost of replacing that is significant. Also, there's a lot of work being done by ASHRAE, if you're familiar with the ASHRAE, that it suggests construction has a lot of embedded emissions in it as well. And so we're creating more emissions to see a system or a boiler cogeneration system not through to its useful life. So it can play a very useful role, not in extending out natural gas and oil and gas, but decarbonizing. The last thing I'd say is that what we are hearing, and I would welcome now or offline to talk about this further. Property owners are struggling about what to do, and paralysis may be a word that comes often. You shifting all of or a significant portion of their current energy to electrification, and then the ability for local electric distribution utilities to provide that power is a challenge. So they're very worried about that transition. In the meantime, and I think this is also some of the work that the NYC Accelerator is doing and others in the city, let's transition over. Can we think about doing just electrifying hot water, right? And making it not an all or nothing proposition, but a combined opportunity that starts, carbon reduction really is the goal and the focus here, without having to say, are we sending out, the oil and gas infrastructure, and that hopefully ends up taking its course. So I'm not sure if that answered your question directly, Mohit, but that's hopefully some information that's helpful.
No, and thank you so much for sharing. I think around the aspects of how this could potentially coexist as a bridge and amongst some of the other points you mentioned is really helpful response. One follow-up I would have is around the storage of the CO2 that's actually captured. So would this be stored in like residential areas, and how do you mitigate risks with storage of what is actually captured?
Yeah, so you asked a great question with the slide I already had open. This number 3 here is liquid CO2, so it's a liquid CO2 tank. Almost every hospital has liquid CO2 tanks stored today in New York City. Schools, restaurants, they all do. There's actually existing code in FDNY and DOB for storing compressed gas, which this is what it is, or it's compressed gas, but it's a liquid. And so there's very little risk or issue, being in the code. It takes into account the storage of this. So there should not be an elevated risk of more tanks like this in buildings. I don't want to sound flippant. The bigger risk is we're not reducing emissions fast enough. But that doesn't answer your question directly. It's safe. And so there really shouldn't be a major risk here. The credit to DOB and the FDNY, they have really detailed codes around how to do all of this work and management. And so, which companies like us will, follow. And it's partly due to the fact that there's already existing CO2 being stored and managed in buildings today.
Thank you.
Mo, does that answer? Do you have a follow-up or does that answer?
No follow-up. Thank you.
Mary, your hand is raised.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. It's such a great presentation. Back in March, there was a lot of publicity around Con Ed's 200th anniversary, and some of it left me with the impression that they were already changing their steam operation over or converting to electricity. Was that just PR? Is that like a future plan that they have, or is that already underway? And sorry, I know you don't work for Con Ed, but you seem to be on top of everything in this regard.
It's a good question, Mary. I don't know specifically. I believe that transition is going to take years and decades. The steam is still, I don't know if it's in here. It's still in here somewhere. Yeah, there's still, I think, 1 or 2 million tons of CO2 emitted, carbon dioxide emitted through the steam operations. It's going to be transitioned out, but over a long period of time. So there is the opportunity to decarbonize. Just be a matter of, I guess, the will to do so and the motivation.
Thank you.
Sure.
Kevin.
First of all, thank you. This is a great presentation. I'm just curious, what is the upfront cost of installing one of these systems compared to just buying the equivalent amount of carbon credits that might be generated by one of these?
Yeah. So the cost, roughly speaking, on what we generally would state is a payback basis. The cost is payback basis is 4 to 7 year payback, which is consistent with other energy asset decisions, whether that be solar, whether that be electrification, although in some cases we're seeing that is even higher. And what does that include? There's a federal tax credit associated with carbon capture specifically. There's the selling of a commodity, carbon dioxide, that again is being sold today, not only to concrete manufacturers, but the hospitals and users of CO2. And then the potential to be used as a reduction for local law 97 purposes, which isn't official yet today. And something that we're working on, and quite frankly, we don't know what the results will be, but we are highly encouraged that it will be accepted. So that would be one way of looking at it. If not for local law 97, there's still a good economic return associated with it, and we're seeing groups like NYSERDA starting to support like alternatives like carbon capture, as well as corporations buying the reductions as offsets. And so instead of, I don't mean to skirt your answer, but a question, but instead of like a dollar basis, it's a 4 to 7 year payback is usually what we see.
Gotcha. Okay. I only ask the question in the sense of that, obviously the commercial real estate market is feeling a little bit of pain right now. Do you have a sense for what the upfront investment is as a percentage of like what a total building's operating capital expenditures, or what might be in a given year? Like, is this going to be a major thing, or is this kind of around?
Yeah. So look, in reducing a 4 to 7 or creating a 4 to 7 year payback, the value is significantly under. So if you see here, here's a rough example on this slide. If we say $57 per ton for carbon capture, that's thinking about local law 97. Local law 97 prices carbon out at $268 per ton. So there's a pretty wide variance between lower variance for the cost of carbon capture as it relates to the cost of compliance with local law 97. In terms of the cost to total operating costs, it is roughly, for a building like the one I'm showing here, 10 to 15%. One time, so it's actually low because that asset will last 15 to 20 years. We were talking about this earlier, where it's very beneficial to match this up. A property owner like this may say, we'd like our boilers to last 15 more years to get the investment out of it, put in carbon capture to that next 15 years. And that's where the bridge gets sort of put together. Perhaps there's an electrification plan that is cheaper, or that is more economical, more bankable in 15 years. And so it's likely that they would move in that direction. But to answer your question, 10 to 15% of their total operating expense for the year, but then those benefits accrue for the next 15 years.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And I don't want to sound like that's for everyone, but that's what we're finding in these cases. It should hold, but we may run into examples where that might not hold. It may be better, or maybe lower, or maybe higher.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about the status of the DOB deliberations, but he said it's still ongoing. No more question.
So I'm just gonna see you have. Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. It's like super fascinating and I think really important. I think you like flashed a slide showing just the investment costs going from multifamily to university, and for electrification, it kind of increases by a lot, like 10 times, but for carbon capture, the increase is maybe only like 3 to 4 times. What accounts for that, like more scalability?
And these are just examples. Every situation is different. Every building's different. Here's a example of a multifamily property where the costs to electrify would be replacing out existing infrastructure, putting in either electric boilers or heat pumps, rewiring the building, upsizing panels, and then there's a cost. Typically what will happen, and it varies by building, but typically what will happen is there'll be a cost to connect that additional electrical load that now is present. With many buildings, we'll see electric demand peak move from the summer to the winter because now they're using electricity for heating. That additional power that will be needed is a cost to connect to the distribution utility, in this case, Con Edison, obviously in New York. Those are some of the costs that are associated for CapEx. On a carbon capture basis, it would be somewhat similar. It would be the design, the hardware, and then mechanical, electrical, and plumbing work that would be done. It's just not as significant because it's more of an add-on. If I have an example here, it's more of like an add-on to their existing infrastructure that doesn't impact their existing infrastructure where, we'd have to start replacing things and upsizing panels and stuff like that. So again, it's generally speaking, but we're finding that it's usually in larger buildings that this is the case. And so what we hear then, without numbers, more qualitatively, is just the challenge to electrify and make that happen. Where we talked to one group, what they said, I think it was a bit of an exaggeration, but in the building, they're going to have everybody on the right side of the building move to the left side of the building for 6 months while they do work on the right side. And then everybody from the left moves to the right to do work on the left side. it sounds a little bit of an exaggeration, but I do think that there's a challenge, especially in retrofits. Like this isn't, sure, if a building is going to be putting in a boiler today, they could consider a carbon capture. If there's a good reason and rationale to electrify from the initial drawings and architectural side of this, totally makes sense. That's really not where we're focused. However, I think folks in the city office have explained that potentially about 90% of buildings that are standing today will be standing in 2050. It's huge, such a huge impact there. And so that's the challenge, is really in these retrofits more than anything else. So why commercial? I mean, it becomes more challenging for commercial and universities where they may have bigger systems, and those systems then are more of a campus style, where they have multiple buildings. It just drives up costs for electrifying, as opposed to carbon capture in that case. But look, we're in some cases, these examples bit story that we're trying to tell, but these are real story, these real examples. And where this is flipped, let's say this first example is flipped, $51 million for carbon capture and $17 million for electrification. Why would somebody do carbon capture? Makes no sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I had one other follow-up related to that. Just when we talk about kind of like the payback period of 4 to 7 years, does that mean that the building who's paying for this also gets all the tax credits and the carbon, the right to sell the carbon? Or are you all like helping facilitate that? Or are you like selling the rights to investments to other people, or how does that work?
If a building owner were to invest their own capital, like we would suggest in this case, then they own all the benefits, and including the environmental attributes, the CO2 being sold, and then the tax credits as well. And so the way we've developed at least our business model is to shepherd that on their behalf to ensure that they are able to achieve the estimates, which we're seeing now as we do projects throughout the city. I don't believe, I'll double check if we're doing a project currently in Community Board 5. I think we're dotting like right around you. Not by design, it just so happens, I think, this example is close to your map, but not exactly in it. And there's a few others on Midtown East and the two in Midtown East that are very close, but not exactly in. Anyway, that's how it would work. We are talking to some groups in your district though currently.
Thanks. Tristan.
Thank you. Just one more question on the DOB evaluation process. Do you know if they're like actively engaging with the public or soliciting people to provide opinions on whether this should be covered by local law 97, or do you know if it's like entirely in-house and they're just reviewing on their end?
The DOB and the mayor's office have, when they announced the Climate Mobilization Act, and obviously local law 97 is part of it, there were working groups that were put together. I don't know the exact working groups offhand, but carbon accounting, I believe there's a technology one, discussed some aspects of the implementation of the law and how, different aspects of it. They didn't really come up with a good way to look at new technologies or the challenges that, maybe not it's the wrong way of saying it, but the feedback loop, it was more closed. They did, however, open up I forget what it was called, but you could submit a inquiry that they could evaluate. But which we ourselves have engaged pretty deeply with the Department of Buildings and the mayor's office. We believe, and it's only through some conversations, and I'd be curious to see your constituents. Some folks who are not in the know don't seem to know what to do. And so when we often talk to groups about, if you talk to anyone about, the challenges you're facing, they'll say no. And I think it's just more of awareness. Maybe it's nobody's fault, but it's just a challenge. And so, but I mean, I don't know if that helps answer your question, Tristan, but there's been somewhat of a feedback loop. However, perhaps it could be, improved.
Great. Any more questions? Any more questions from the committee? Anybody online? Questions from the committee? Any attendees? Any attendee questions? Any more questions at all? Seeing none, I'm going to say thank you so much, Brian. We really, really appreciate you being here. And we thank you for all the information and bringing the committee up to date and the community up to date on what carbon capture is and how it can be used in New York. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all the work you do. And if anything ever pops up, please don't hesitate to reach out. Be happy to help.
Thank you. Thank you
All the
very, very
best.
much. Me too. That was very interesting. Okay, next up, we have finally our budget requests. You guys all are aware, those online, that we formally submit our budget request to the city in October. As OMB and the agencies, they begin to prepare for next year's budget. We do both the capital and the expense requests. And I've recently learned, it'll surprise you, I think as much as me, that there is no cap on the number of, yeah.
So you don't have to horse trade anymore, we could just dump them all.
Exactly. So we've learned that there's no cap on the number of submissions that we may make. So our deliverables are therefore expense and capital requests, however many as we determine, that need to be submitted by October 3rd. So you'll remember, because we don't have the schools, because we don't have the night shed, we always struggled with the capital and had a ton of expense. So this year we're able to submit our requests as they occur. And then we have the statement of need, which is really the narrative statement of our budget request, along with the greater policy issues that we have in the district. So Marissa and I met yesterday, I think it was yesterday, with OMB to go over, I sent you all the list of our previous last year's requests. And we went over what OMB is recommending we take out and why, what were policy issues, what could be better managed in terms of, or massaged in terms of language for our request, what needed more specificity, so, and what should be held over because it hasn't been done. So I'm going to go through that material. I haven't had the opportunity since that meeting to go through, and I'm going to send with the updates to you. So the committee has that. But to start working on our budget requests now, we're going to do it. Julie and I were talking about it. And we had this idea of a way of doing it, which is a little different than the previous years. Instead of going into the silos, remember the silos, the different for the newbies in the group. The requests are put into what we called silos. So it was either sort of healthcare and services, or youth education and child welfare. It was each, according to like housing, economic development, and land use. There were all these different silos. Instead of putting teams on silos to look for the requests in those areas, this year we thought we'd do something different. And what we do is have teams work on, one team work on just school outreach, just get the requests from schools. Another team just do a request to all of the bids and see what they were thinking about in terms of their needs. The next one is a request to community organizations. Julie's going to work on the document along with me of the previous requests, and we'll review them, and I'll dump in everything that I've learned from OMB. We need to do outreach to the chairs of other committees to see what they have to say about what they're hearing for budget requests. a survey of census and data and, what's out there in terms of, I sent you all those tools that the city provides just in terms of census data and things that are changing in our district that might inform how we do our narrative and our needs statement. And then somebody needs to speak to the board office and sort of take all of the complaints and comments and things that have come in from constituents and help us massage that into our budget requests as well. And then finally, we have the outreach to other stakeholders like nonprofits. Like I think we've always reached out, for example, to Coalition of the Homeless and other non-for-profits to ask what they were hearing and what they thought was happening in our district, just in terms of and for budget requests. So with that in mind, first of all, I want to ask if any newbies have any questions, because I know that you haven't gone through an orientation specifically for Bex yet. The budget request is sort of one of the mandates for the committee and something we have to do every year. It's a statement of need about the district and then budget requests that we hear from constituents, from stakeholders, from people who live and work within the district. They tend to be primarily expense. We get a lot of expense. Those are what you might imagine, salary requests or funding for a particular program versus capital requests, which might be funding for a school or something like that. So what do you guys think of that approach? I'm sorry, I don't mean to ignore the people who are online. What do you think of that approach as opposed to the way we did it before?
That makes sense. So that way there's not overlapping outreach to some of these organizations that fall in multiple buckets.
Right, that's what was happening. Remember, the bids were getting contacted by everybody and yeah. So having said that, do people have any preferences in terms of the schedule? In terms of the schedule, we are gonna have our next meeting, I think it's September 3rd. I'm gonna send you the calendar for CB 5 and particularly Bex, because Joe and I were looking and I had it wrong and
I had it wrong.
no, I had it wrong also. So just to make sure everybody has it, but our next meeting is in September. So it gives us 2 months to sort of work on this and bring back whatever, we are, whatever you're assigned to work on it. That sounds,
I'll do the bids.
you'll do the bids?
Should I?
That was good. Who wants to work with Joe in the bids?
I can
And
work on the business.
And should we include the liaison, the board liaison with the bids?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
I can do a school outreach.
School, so Bradley is doing school outreach. I wonder if, I'm trying to get some of our newbies, Moet and Lazar, are you still there?
I'm here. I'm happy to plug in across any of the areas.
Okay. Moet, do you have any particular interest? Charles, do you have any particular interest? That you will,
I don't know if there's too many people doing the bids, but I was thinking because I've been in contact with the bids a lot when they help me with accessibility needs and things. So sometimes I have a good relationship with them, and have contact with them. So I was
Okay.
thinking, but if there's too many, I could do something else.
okay,
We could divvy it up.
what?
We'll divvy it up.
Okay, I think that would work, Charles, if you can work with Joe and Zona because you're new on the committee, that might be a good way to segue into some of the work. Brad is on education. Is anyone interested in working with Brad, reaching out to the schools? Is that
I can,
Laura? Will
Yeah.
you work with Brad? Okay. Okay, so we need someone to, I also want to back up. The OMB has a survey that they have promulgated that we can use, that we can send out, and they've started to get response. They have it on their own that we can use. It's like a link. So that we can ask the bids, can they put it on their website, and I'll send that to you. Marissa has it. So I will send you that link as well.
What's the survey asking?
The survey's asking, what do you see in the district? I can pull it up for you.
Is
here.
it essentially trying to solicit?
It's trying to solicit community input. We have done a survey in the past, so it's sort of similar, like sort of what have you seen in the district? What is the best thing? What is the worst thing? What would you approve? Just to sort of get the solicitations and use those for informing our budget requests. This is actually done by OMB, so now it's just a link for us, and they are going to sort of monitor that and see what comes back. So when we do outreach to anybody, we can ask, hey, can you use our link? Is there anywhere you can publicize that? Okay,
Renee.
Yeah.
I was also wondering if the newbies could work with Brad, because I've been here 3 years. so
okay, sure.
You might want to ask.
All right, well, we have a lot of people, so I think we're gonna have like 2 or 3 or even
Oh,
4.
okay, so
Does anyone want to do the outreach to the state, to the nonprofits?
So,
Tristan, anybody want to work with Tristan on the nonprofits?
I'm happy to
So
do that.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can help out.
Okay, and I'm gonna put Mary on that too. So we have Mary, Tristan and Moet on that. Okay, summary of the complaints and issues heard by the board office. So it's liaison with Marissa here, just talking about what's come in. Do you want to do that, Kevin?
Sure. I'm happy to do whatever. I know the new people kind of get the less popular tasks. So I'm fine with that, but I probably need to pair up with somebody.
Yeah. No, we're not.
No, that's fine. It is what it is. But I
Okay.
probably need to pair up with somebody just because I have no idea what I'm doing.
Absolutely. I'm wondering if I could, Mark, would that be something that
Yeah,
you
it's
would,
fine.
is that okay? All right, so that's literally just reaching out here to Marissa and seeing, you know, what has come in, what's the trending. And then there's outreach to other chairs of the other committees. I wonder, let me see, who are we missing? We're missing Pete and Seth and Zazar. Zazar, do you have a preference?
I think they're on. I don't think she's there.
Okay, so maybe I will do Seth and Zazar on that. And then what we have left as well is the borough consultations that you all remember is when agencies come and they answer questions that are put to them. We are late to the party in terms of getting a lot of questions into them, but Marissa is also going to try and work with some of the bigger ones that we tend to have questions for, like DOT and DOB, and arrange meetings so that we can ask very specifically and sort of align our requests with sort of their initiatives so that, you know what I mean, there's some alignment there, so we have some hope of maybe getting our requests fulfilled. In order to do that, we probably need our questions for them in advance, so it would, yeah.
Can it not just be the questions about some of the items we had last year? That feels like a good place to start
Yes,
for a lot of those.
absolutely. I mean, I have a ton of questions.
Sure, yeah,
like,
among other things, yeah.
But what I wanted to do is put to the entire committee, Julie and I are gonna start this Google document that we do every year. And if you have questions that you think are particularly pertinent to a particular agency that would be really useful to answer for this process, just throw them in there so that we can have them ready and we can give them to Marissa in advance.
What's the deadline for that?
The deadline as soon as possible, but we want to do that, I'd say within the next 3 to 4 weeks. And then the deliverable for this would be at our next meeting, so
Yeah.
everybody should,
I
yeah.
just remember those being, they need like the questions in advance.
The questions need to be, you know, we are late on those questions in terms of the borough, but very specific for Manhattan, Marissa is still gonna try and arrange our very specific consultations with the agencies. So ASAP would be the timing on that. Mark?
Are they usually responsive to the questions? Because I remember a document previously where they had very like formulaic answers.
I would say we are more likely to have a good response on the conversations that we have through Marissa sitting down with the agencies, the borough consultations. The process is that the questions are written, they're presented in advance, the agency writes them down in advance, and then there's the whole sort of readout of the answers. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, is what I'm saying. What, are we missing anything else? Which one? Census. Oh, there's one other thing. There's the census, and there's a lot of new data out there in the tools. Is anybody really good at manipulating all of the data and the tools? Isabel does not have a role.
Is that
And-
Excel?
I'm sorry.
Is that like in Excel?
It was open and like.
It's Open NYC.
Yeah,
There's a new,
yes.
there's a new environmental dashboard that was just shared with me today that I can share with the person that shows sort of, you know, environmental pollution and things. This is, so if somebody wants to survey, Kevin, you're being very, you're hazing yourself here. And I'm certainly gonna do that, and I'm sure Julie will do it as well, but just sort of like looking at that data and seeing, you know, what pops out at you that we should definitely include, like if things are changing within the district, or Julie and I were really amazed when we look at our district, look at that for air pollution, the whole of the city. That was a surprise to us, so something to be used with all of those tools, if we can start extracting the data.
I could take a look at it too.
Could you? That would be great, because every time I personally use open data, I get to where I'm going and then it explodes on me. Anything else? Does everybody, Joe?
So I have something that I want to include as part of the budget process.
Yeah.
It does not fit neatly within our standard process. We're gonna have a speaker at some point, maybe at September, who's gonna drill home an issue that is, it's a budget issue in New York City that you can't see on the street. It's not like you're gonna see more homeless because of this. It's not more drug users. But what this issue is, there is less money to spend on all these priorities. There'll be less money to spend on all the priorities that we're gonna come up with because of the way the budget is structured. I would love to include that issue, that budgetary issue in our process. It may not be on any of the capital or expenditure list. It may be a letter or a resolution or something that all community boards should probably follow.
So Truth in Accounting, who's going to sort of talk about that process with us, I think that's what you're referring to. They're coming to our next meeting. And when we spoke with the OMB yesterday, they said these sort of policy issues, which this might be more of a policy. So when we write our budget requests, and we'll get to that when we have our September meeting and put those budgets requested, they have explained we should sort of focus on, can you fund X very specifically, like as a yes or no. So when we do our budget request, and you're right. And then when we have questions like yours that don't fit in neatly into that bracket or that bucket, that should be in our district needs statement. All our policy needs should be woven into our narrative there, because they do get recognized in that way. But that's not to say that we cannot hear that as a resolution when they come to the committee in September.
I have a question. Maybe this is the community organizations, but like, I remember last year, like firehouses wanted, I think, like generators, or maybe they wanted plows, or they wanted something.
Yes.
Which of these buckets picks up that request for this year?
So all of the requests, if the request has been funded, it will go off. Julie and I are gonna work on what OMB gave me for things that were not funded, and they're gonna go right back in. And if they were funded, we will be done. The borough consultations for things like fire and the library, they usually come to us with one request. Like the New York Public Library comes with one request, and they say, please make this a budget request, because that's what they really want. And that's how that gets in there.
So, but if they have a new one for 2023.
That will come out of the borough consultations.
All right.
Like Marissa will hear that, and I'm gonna give that schedule to all of you so that we can all take a turn, should you wish, to be on those consultations, but we'll certainly get the feedback, because they do write out the answers to those questions as well. But the meat of those conversations tends to be at the very end, where somebody, beyond the questions that were written down, somebody will say any more questions, and you have the opportunity for that impromptu question, right?
Great.
I have a question. Sorry. I have a question. So when it comes to the libraries, do the libraries submit a budget as a whole entity? Because you know, in our district we have the Braden Talking Book Library, which is very unique because it's the only one serving the blind community specifically in the whole of the 5 boroughs. So I'm just wondering, like, will we be can we approach a specific library, you know, or do we have to, or is it just libraries in general?
No, we have a contact at the New York Public Library, and we work with them on their request each year. And that sort of streamlines instead of, they are aware of the libraries, and we had for the Haskell Library, I believe it was the roof last year until it got funded. It did get funded, but it was on our request as a capital request. The library that you're referring to, that was the request one year. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, and it did get funded. So the library itself, within our district, they give us their requests. So that's one area where we don't go to every single local library.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
What about the parks, like Central Park Conservancy, where's that captured?
I mean, we can capture that in the other stakeholders and nonprofits. So that's just in Mowat and Mary. And we should also get some inkling from, say, parks, like Craig, our
Yeah.
chair of parks. So hopefully we can pull those threads, Any other questions from anyone in the committee? Oh, sorry, Mark.
With respect to the communications between the entities and the board office, is there a specific deadline for when everyone needs to send in their comments, just so we know when to check in?
I would say, so we have the 2 months. We have this period now between now and our next meeting. By our next meeting on the Google Sheet, everybody should have been dumping.
Okay, but
There-
do the entities know when to get in their comments to the board office? So we know that.
You're talking about agencies.
Yeah, the agencies, no, like it's whoever, like we're in touch with.
Oh, whoever you're doing the outreach to, say to them, I'm doing this process and I need, if you could let me know by such and such. So you set the
Okay.
date just to ensure that you have it. Julie and I will set up, what I'll do this week is I'll send out to everyone their assignments, just to reiterate everyone's assignment. I'll include, depending on what you have, like Brad, I'll send you the list of the schools in our district, so it's easy and nice. And, I'll do that for the nonprofits that we've been working for. I'll do it for the tools that we've had before. So it's a little bit easy for everyone. And then we'll have the Google document. We'll dump everything in there. I'll give you updates. I'll try not to inundate your inbox, but as we get dates with agencies, I'll let you know what questions we have. You can refer to the Google Doc, add anything in there. And we'll take it from there. And our next meeting, we'll do some frustrating.
So the next one is, because I thought it was on
Oh, no,
October.
it's not. It's October.
Okay.
No, the next meeting, we'll just sort of touch in with each other. You're right. You're absolutely right. We have the September and then October is our final. So September we'll touch in with everybody just to make sure that we are where we are. Everybody has done what they needed to do. If there's any problems, we can talk about them then. But Julie and I are always available as well. So if you run into any problems or you have any questions, or please just let us know. But
We don't need the horse trade in October.
and then we would, yeah, exactly. It's gonna go so smoothly, you're not gonna believe it. We've done it in 10 minutes.
Discuss the prioritization of it.
Exactly. And then I'll just end, is there any new business before I end? Any new business?
The budget request goes with the district needs statement, right?
The budget request and the district needs statement go hand in hand, and one will inform the other.
Should we brief the newbies on the district needs statement or?
The district needs statement is a statement that's sort of, as it sounds, it's sort of an overview of our district, what we see is fantastic about it, what we see as problematic, and it sort of mirrors the budget request that we're making. And it touches a lot on the policy issues, a little bit more than the specific budget requests. That makes sense. And I have last year's, and I can send that to you. Everybody who's new on the committee, I want to say welcome again, and I'm going to send you a whole bunch of material, and we're going to think about how perhaps we can do an initiation, if you will, to Beth.
Great. Just with regards to like the top 3 issues set up, like since we are doing that differently this year, how are we going to decide? Like, remember last year we would have each silo nominate some issues. Who's going to decide the nomination?
I think what we will do is once we see the requests, so as you get requests, we'll just look and see what the top 3 issues. We're going to have a survey this year. So first of all, we're going to have survey responses. So already I think there's one survey in there already. You're seeing what is important to people. And I think it sort of rises to the top as opposed to, if that makes sense. You know, we look at how many people said, I don't know. Sheds are concerned. If 100 people said sheds were a concern and nobody said something else, that would be our top issue of the day, right? Does that make sense? Any other questions? I'm sorry, I feel Charles, Mo, and Mary, I feel like I'm turning my back
Yes.
to you.
Um,
Questions or-
I was wondering how do we communicate with our fellow members who are you know on these teams that we're on? Are we working through Google or email or phone, or how are we going to be
So what I'll do
communicating?
Is this week, I will give everyone the assignment and on that email will be everyone else, the emails of the people that you'll be working with within the committee. The full committee will be on that email. And you can decide amongst your team how you wish to communicate, when you wish to talk and when you wish to meet. And how you'll divvy up the work.
Okay, well, it'd be easier if I could request my two teammates to email me. It'd be, you know, to let me know how they would like to communicate would be fantastic.
Email works.
Okay,
Perfect. Thank you.
Zona and Joe, thank you, Zona and Joe. Okay. All right, and I think with that, we are adjourned. It's great to see everybody tonight and see you all again soon.
See you in September.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Right.
Now, how do I? Can I do it? Oh, I do it over here?
Sure, I have your email, Joe.
Yeah.
I'll take it out. Bye.
Yeah.